Hey, it's Mr. Shrum, and welcome back to another walkthrough tutorial for bio. And today we're going to look at the skeletal and muscle systems. At the end of this lesson, hopefully you'll be able to develop and use a model to explain how the musculoskeletal system works with the nervous system for movement and support. So let's dive right into the warm-up question. The muscular system and the skeletal system are two different organ systems, but they're often referred to jointly as the musculoskeletal system. Why do you think the word musculoskeletal exists in the first place? What similarities and functions do you think the muscular system and the skeletal system have? And the sample answer: this word exists because both systems are involved in movement and support of the body. They work together to perform these functions. Bones provide support and give your body structure, while the muscles give strength, and the contraction and relaxation of muscles allow for different movements. So they're very intertwined. And another warm-up question: Ian experiences pain in his leg after a fall, so he visits a doctor. And after the exam, the doctor explains to Ian that he has injured a piece of tissue that connects his leg muscle to the bone. What piece of tissue is the doctor describing? Well, we have a choice of cartilage, joint, ligament, but tendon is the correct choice. That is a fibrous cord made of protein that attaches a muscle to a bone. And we'll learn all about that in the upcoming slides. But first of all, we're going to talk about the skeletal system. The human skeleton consists of 206 bones. Biologists consider bones to be an organ because it consists of several different types of tissue. It includes bone tissue, cartilage, connective tissue, and nervous tissue. Bones provide a framework for the body and gives it structure and support. Your ribs and skull protect vulnerable organs like your brain, your spinal cord, heart, and lungs from shock and injury. Bones also enable movement by providing attachment sites for muscles. So we're going to take a look at the skeletal structure of humans and the different types of bones that make up the skeleton. Here we get a nice visual. And then we get another more specific upper picture of your upper body. The human skeletal system has two main divisions: the axial skeleton, sometimes we call that the central skeleton, and then we have the appendicular skeleton, and we call that the peripheral skeleton. And the axial skeleton is shown right here. This is the central main part of your body. And this consists of 80 bones, including the skull, your vertebral column, your sternum, and ribs. The axial skeleton protects vital internal organs such as the brain, the spinal cord, heart, and lungs. Then we have the appendicular skeleton, or the peripheral skeleton. That is made up of your arms and legs, your limbs. And in this region, we have 126 bones in our arms and legs. Biologists identify two groups of bones in the appendicular skeleton: the group of bones that forms the limbs and the group of bones that attach the limbs to the axial skeleton. The bones that attach to the upper limbs to the axial skeleton at the shoulder are called the pectoral girdle. So the bone attaching the upper limbs to the axial skeleton at the shoulder is the pectoral girdle. The bones of the pelvic girdle attach to the lower limbs at the hip. So shoulder, pectoral girdle, pelvis, we have the pelvic girdle. Now getting into the actual bones, we have bone tissue. Bone is a type of connective tissue that biologists call osseous tissue. And that is Latin meaning bony. Bone tissue consists of cells separated from each other by a matrix. And if you click on matrix, bone matrix is secreted by special bone cells called osteoblasts. Bone matrix consists of water, collagen fibers, which is a type of protein, and inorganic salt crystals. Calcium phosphate in the form of the natural mineral hydroxyapatite, hydroxyapatite is the most abundant inorganic salt found in the matrix. Calcium phosphate is the most abundant inorganic salt found in the matrix. We just read that. There are two types of bone tissue. We have compact bone and spongy bone. The difference between those tissues lies in their density. A single bone often contains both types of bone tissue. Compact bone is denser, stronger. The structural unit of compact bone tissue is called osteon, or Haversian system. Each osteon has a central canal that carries blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. Compact bone tissue is found in the outer layer of the bones. It's also found in the shaft of longer bones. Spongy bone is porous and light, so think of a sponge. It does not contain concentric patterned osteons like the compact bone. Spongy bone tissue makes up all short, flat, and irregular bones. And it makes up the edges of long bones, as you can see here. Red bone marrow is found in these spaces in spongy bones. This type of marrow produces red blood cells and white blood cells. In infants, almost all the bones contain red bone marrow. Children have more red bone marrow than adults do. This marrow is found in the heads of long bones, such as the humerus of the arm and the femur of the leg. It's also found in the sternum, ribs, pelvis, and vertebrae. Yellow bone marrow consists of fat. The majority of the bone marrow in adults consists of this yellow bone marrow. Under extreme circumstances, the human body can turn yellow bone marrow into red bone marrow. These changes may occur with diseases such as anemia or when there's excessive blood loss. In addition to bones, the human skeleton consists of connective tissues such as cartilage and ligaments. These tissues support the function of bones by providing shape and support to the body. Cartilage is a firm but flexible connective tissue. In adults, cartilage supports the skeletal structure. It attaches the ribs to the sternum, for example. It also covers the ends of bones, providing a smooth gliding surface for certain types of joints. Ligaments are bands of fibrous connective tissue. Their most common function is to connect two bones. Ligaments also strengthen joints and prevents the abnormal movement of joints. You can see that here. Major markings on the skeleton. The surface of a bone is covered with projections, depressions, and openings. These features are called bone markings. They act as attachment points for ligaments, tendons, and other bones. They also help with protective functions of the skeleton. Let's learn more about some of these specific markings. And the first is foramina. The foramen is a hole in the bone. It acts as an opening to allow blood vessels, nerves, and muscles enter the bone. The skull has several foramina through which nerves and blood vessels pass. For example, the mental foramina are found on each side of the mandible. Here we have the supraorbital foramen, the zygomaticofacial foramen, the infraorbital foramen, and the mental foramen. Then we have fossae, or fossa. That's the plural form. Fossa is a shallow depression in a bone. Some form a joint with another bone. For example, the mandibular fossa is a depression in the temporal bone of the skull. You can see that here. See how it goes in a little bit in the skull? The projections of the mandible fit into this depression. So there is a depression, a little hole created on this side of the skull, and this jaw, the mandible, fits right in there. And this forms the joint between the lower jaw and your skull. A fossa may also hold some internal glands or organs. Fossae in the bones that form the skull accommodate different parts of the brain. And you have tubercles, and those are small nodular outgrowth on a bone. It's a site for the attachment of tendons or ligaments. The articular tubercle serves as an attachment point for ligaments that join the mandible to the temporal bone of the skull. Let's see. Oops. The skeletal and muscle systems tutorial. So we're on to our next question that checks progress or just sees if you're understanding what's happening. But we're dragging each label to the correct location on the image. It shows the femur bone of the leg and part of the skull. Identify the various bone markings in the image. Well, remember that fossa are depressions. Foramen are little openings, little holes. Foramen are little holes. Fossa are depressions. And a tubercle is a little outgrowth on a bone. And if we go back here, foramen, that's a hole. Fossa, it's a little dip, like a little depression. And then a tubercle, see how there's this bone here, and then it kind of goes outward. That's a tubercle. Now we're going to talk about joints. Joints, also called articulations, are regions of the body where two or more bones meet. The contraction of muscles attached to the bones enable movement. The nature of the joint helps determine the direction in which the body can move. Ball and socket joints, that's when a rounded head or a ball-shaped bone fits into a cup-shaped cavity or little opening known as the socket of another bone. Ball and socket joints provide the greatest range of motion. These joints are found in the hips and shoulders, allowing the arms and legs to swing. So here's an example of that. We have this ball, this round bone going into a socket, which creates an opening for the bone to attach. There is another type of joint known as a pivot joint. That is a ring formed by a bone and a ligament surrounds a rounded bone. This joint allows rotational movement of the rounded bone. Pivot joints are found in the neck and wrist, as well as in the joint that allows your forearm to rotate at the elbow. A hinge joint, that is the convex surface of one bone fits into a concave depression of another bone. A hinge joint enables movement only in one plane, or back and forth movement. Think of your elbow joint and your knee joint. They can bend one way, but they don't bend in the opposite direction. It's more like a door. Like you can open most doors one way, but not the other. You can also have gliding joints, two flat bones of approximately the same size lying against each other. The joint enables side-to-side movement as the bones glide over each other. It can allow movement in multiple planes, but ligaments and other bones restrict the movement of the joints to only a specific direction. Think of your wrist and ankle joints as examples of gliding joints. Then we have a suture joint that forms when bones tightly join together with a thin layer of connective tissue between them. These are immovable joints. All the joints in the skull, except the joint with the lower jawbone, are suture joints. Which type of joint is found between the lower jaw and the skull? Think of that as a hinge joint. Jaw moves only in one direction. The joint between the jaw and skull is a hinge joint. So a good way to think about these is to pick one or two examples for each and then associate that with the joint. Ball and socket, think of your shoulder. Gliding, think of your wrists and ankle. Hinge, think of your knee, elbow, and now the jaw and skull. And then a pivot. And the pivot, a good example of that is your neck and wrist and your forearm. Growth of the skeletal system. In an embryo, the skeleton begins to form as cartilage. And as it develops, the cartilage acts as a framework on which bone tissue forms. The process by which bone tissue forms on this framework of cartilage is called ossification. Throughout the stages of the fetus, bone tissue deposits on the cartilage. At birth, most of the cartilage has been replaced by bone. Bone tissue continues to replace additional cartilage throughout childhood. By age 30, most adults reach peak bone density. Thereafter, bone density decreases with age, even though the skeleton continues to repair and replace tissue for its entire life. Bone density varies from person to person. Aside from age, other factors determine the amount of bone density a person possesses. Men tend to have a larger skeleton than women. Heavier people develop denser bones to support their weight. The amount of calcium in a person's diet also plays a role in the development of bone density. As a baby grows, the cartilage in the bones is converted to bone tissue. Bone remodeling. A baby's bones must keep pace with the baby's growth in size. The process by which bones grow is called bone remodeling. This process involves replacing old bone tissue with new bone tissue. Bone replacement is a continuous process occurring throughout a person's life. Bone remodeling begins in the center of the bone. Special bone cells called osteoclasts break down bone tissue. Osteoclasts release the minerals from the bone into the blood. This process is called bone resorption. At the same time, we have osteoblasts with a B contributing to the bone formation. These bone cells create new bone by secreting new bone matrix on the outside of the bone. Osteoblasts transform their shape to form osteocytes, which maintain the mineral concentration of the matrix. So here we go. This picture breaks it down. Osteoblasts are creating new bone. Osteocytes, that's a misspelling right there, are formed from osteoblasts, and these guys, they are maintaining the mineral concentration of the new bone matrix. So osteoblasts make new bone, and then osteocytes maintain the matrix as it is. Then we have the osteoclasts. Those break down bones. So keep these three separate in your head so you don't get too confused. And nutrition is important for growth. Calcium is essential for building and repairing bones. Vitamin D helps the body absorb calcium taken in through food, and that is also essential. So calcium and vitamin D, big nutritional help. But yeah, just advice, keep osteoblasts, osteocyte, and osteoclast, and be able to remember which is which. Bone repair. So a break in a bone caused by an injury is called a fracture. And there are two types of fractures. When a bone breaks without piercing and emerging through the skin, it's called a simple fracture. If the bone comes through the skin, it's called a compound fracture. When a bone breaks, blood begins to flow from the blood vessels torn by the fracture. Within 8 hours, blood clots from a solid swelling called a fracture hematoma between the ends of the broken bone. About 48 hours, so 2 days after the fracture, a mass of cartilage called a callus forms around the fracture. This callus is very soft, which is why it's important to hold healing bones in place. Over the next 3 weeks, osteoclasts reabsorb the old bone near the break. Osteoblasts convert the cartilaginous callus into spongy bone through the process of ossification. So it's making new bone. Eventually, osteoclasts remove the spongy bone, while osteoblasts create compact bone tissue to complete the healing process. Nutrition plays an important role in healing, and a lack of calcium in the diet can slow bone repair. So we have the hematoma formation here, the callus formation, bony callus formation, and then healed fracture. Really interesting stuff. So 8 hours, the blood, within 8 hours of a fracture, blood clots. Then we have a callus form. Then we have the osteoclasts breaking down bones, osteoblasts creating new bones, and the fracture eventually heals. Okay, so another question. When a person loses too much bone density as they age or never reach peak bone density to begin with, they can develop a condition called osteoporosis. People with osteoporosis have what are called brittle bones and an increased risk of fractures. Anyone can get osteoporosis, but the following groups are most susceptible: all women over age 50, Women are 4 times more likely than men to develop osteoporosis, and people with smaller skeletal frames. Why do you think these groups have a high risk of osteoporosis? And the sample answer, we know that people develop different bone densities. Women tend to develop less dense bones than men, and they are more likely to experience serious bone loss as they age. We also know that people with thin body frames tend to have lower bone density, which may put them at risk for osteoporosis as they age. Next question. Calcium is an essential nutrient for all ages, but many marketing campaigns for high calcium foods focus on childhood. Do you think there's merit to telling children to get their calcium because it builds strong bones? Explain your response. Okay. Calcium is an essential nutrient for all ages. Blah, 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 blah. Sample answer. Yeah, there's merit to targeting children in marketing campaigns for high calcium food. People reach peak bone mass at about age 30. If children don't consume enough calcium, they may not build up enough bone density, which could cause them to be at risk for osteoporosis when they're older. And that's it for the skeletal system. Next time, we're going to look at the muscular system. But until then, stay safe and warm, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.